Okay, talking about primarily the reason my father left Europe along with his entire family. I don't think we'll touch much on your mother.
Yeah, this we could talk about.
So we're going to talk about the father.
Yeah.
First, I want to set a stage. The stage in Germany, when my father reached adulthood, was that of chaos, financial, and personal security was all threatened. We had come to the end of World War I, and the nation of Germany was suffering defeat, although there was no defeat, where they had the style of government that's called empire, where the government was run by an emperor, like an old-fashioned version of an English king, and all of the people down to be the emperor, his children, then the landed class, the lords and what you have. Then you would have the industrial barons, then you would have the skilled professional people, and the rest of the peons all the way down. 90% of the people were peons. And what defined a poor class was a lack of ownership of land. Did not mean they weren't skilled people like a bricklayer or a butcher. They just didn't own anything except maybe a residence. And so that's how Europe was structured in most of Germany. When the end of the war came, everybody agreed that they wanted to get rid of the monarchy, which they did unceremoniously. And then they argued for about 10 years and much strife over what form of socialism they should have. And the socialism would break down into 2 or 3 different strong groups, or like political parties. And there was lots of fighting. When my dad reached the age where he could be drafted, which was about 1920, 1921, he was drafted into what we would call the National Police Force. They were not allowed by the treaty that settled World War I by allowed to have any standing army, but they were allowed to have what you would call a draft to supply a police force to enforce the rules within Germany. He was drafted, and he became the victim of all the conflicts, those soldiers that were in the army, in the conflicts between the various socialist groups. And the various socialist groups were very militant, to the point where they had their own militias and they had their own munitions, and they were fighting and killing one another at very high rates. And this is the kind of chaos that Germany was in because of a lack of a strong government. And so this was a very sad time, and I think the dad and the entire Schaerfls family got very worried about lack of security, lack of financial security, lack of safety, lack of opportunity. What else could I mention that Germany represented at this time? So I think that they planned to come to Europe, from Europe to the United States, in steps. And the way I understand it is that Grandma and the 3 girls, Rosa, Annie, and Dora, came across first and settled with people in Cleveland, with people that they knew. Then I understand my Uncle Tony came, and then about 1930 my father came, because he was the one supporting the operation with income. And so that's how they came into the United States. The reasons that my dad told me, he didn't talk about it very often. He remembered an experience he had when he was somewhere in central Germany in the military police force, and he was told he and a couple other young men were to guard an armory. An armory would be a strong building in each city where the government stored guns and ammunition, so that the equipment would be there when they need it. And the 3 factions, one of them was the radical socialists, another one was the communist socialists, and the other one was the democratic socialists. Notice they're all socialists. Wanted those munitions so they could carry on their struggle with the other parties to win dominance within Germany, and that dominance would be determined by how many people they had in the parliament. so that their party's will could be governing, if they had the majority of the seats in Parliament. And you have to understand parliamentary government to even understand what I'm talking about. It's not the same as the United States Congress. That even the administration is an outgrowth of the Parliament, not a separate branch of government. That's different than America. So that's the environment he was in when he decided then and there, laying in a guardhouse on an elevated platform made out of thick sheet metal, with bullets bouncing off of his guardhouse all night long, that he was going to leave Germany. There was no future in the fatherland. Because that's a big move. You change culture, job, opportunity, you get into an unfamiliar situation. That's a big move for anyone, to move not only from one city to another, but from one country to another, and leave everything else behind. And so that was very dramatic, and the family decided it was worth it to do that. And they were not the only ones. Tens of thousands of Germans and Italians and what we call Eastern European countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, were migrating to the United States. Well over 1 million people a year were being accepted into the United States. But you had to be qualified. You had to be free of a communicable disease. The male had to have a usable skill, could demonstrate that he was a craftsman of some kind, and that everyone was educated beyond a certain grade, that they could read and write, and that they were all escaping troubled political situations. And you had to have a sponsoring family to get into the country. And then 98% of them would come to Ellis Island, which is right next to the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. So that's how they came over. They came over, the girls, and then Uncle Tony, and then my dad. And it was quite an experience. They all settled in Cleveland because there was a very large German-speaking community in Germany, particularly what we call Southern or Bavarian Germans. So they spoke a common language. And they were welcomed, they had sponsors, and they were brought into the country, and the sponsor had to provide employment. No one could come over and be on the dole. They could not come over and be on public welfare. You would not get in the country with that restriction. You had to have the papers showing that there was somebody taking responsibility, fiscal responsibility for your coming over. So that was the situation. Now, I just wanted to mention a few things about what they were leaving. How much time?
We can
3
stop.
minutes? Okay. Okay, second part of today, I want to talk about what Dad left, a little bit about the tempo of German life, and what were the cumulative factors in their leaving. First of all, the difference between different types of German people. The greatest contrast is between Bavarians in the south and the Prussians in the north. The Bavarians were romantic. They loved music, they loved fun, and they took life with a grain of salt. The Prussians were the exact opposite. Although they spoke a very similar language, German, they were militant, stiff upper lip, always had to be in control, and if you were out of control, they were extremely strict people. No fun at all. It was the difference. My father and his family all came from a good Bavarian, happy environment and relationship. And if you see the movie The Sound of Music, you see my dad's family. That was my dad's family, singing about everything. Germany was an empire, and they lost their emperor at the end of World War I. And with that went rule, with that went pride, with that went good order, and the confidence that it was in belonging to the German Empire. The war brought defeat, depression, and lots of serious socio-economic problems. The biggest problem with the environment in Germany after World War I was the void caused by dismissing the emperor. How would the Germans govern themselves? Well, the prevailing theory was that it would be a form of socialism, where the people had the power of government. And it would have been in a parliamentary type of government structure. However, the Germans couldn't agree on what kind of socialism. And so they broke up into three major socialistic groups. One was very communistic. That would be very top-down socialism, which is an irony. It's ironic. The next one would be very militant socialism, and they were very militant with guns and rules and everything. And the other one was a classical parliamentary socialism, where they tried to implement socialism through the rulings of the parliament. And there was a great conflict between these. All of these conflicts added up into my father's unhappiness. Now, in the family, there was a lot of economic and familial insecurity. During World War I, the family Schaerfls business in Kochel, Germany, in the Alps, the foothills of the Alps, the family business was furniture making. When the Italians, who were on the side of the Allies in World War I, would fly over the Alps to bomb Munich, if they felt they were running out of fuel or they were lost in a fog or for whatever reason, they would just dump their bombs on the nearest German community and fly back to Italy with less bomb load to get over the mountains. Well, they completely blew up my grandpa's furniture factory. And so there went the family income.
And this is in World War I?
In World War I, 1918, early in 1918, late 1917, they totally destroyed the Schaerfls furniture factory, which was how the family lived for their income. And so now they became insecure people financially. A lot of pride of who you were was eroded. The national security was totally in the drink, and we had lost so many loved ones in the family. The man I was named after, Wilhelm Schmidt, was killed in that war. Nobody ever found his body, and so just this past Sunday we had a massive internment for him to be rest in peace. But I don't know, I think something like 10 or 15 people in the Schaerfls, Schmidt, Mergel family circle were killed in World War I. Now that left a big aching pain in the family. Then we had economic distress. I was just explaining how bad the inflation was in Germany in the 1920s. And I can't even express to you the reality of how bad inflation was. But if you compared what $1 worth of marks was in 1918 or 1920, the inflation had made it worth 1 billion marks to a dollar. And it just blows your mind. You cannot comprehend how many wheelbarrows of marks it took to go to the grocery store and get one loaf of bread in the years after World War I. So that economic distress, and then the last straw I think that broke the camel's back for my family was the social unrest, where the three socialist parties were fighting each other, not just politically, but militarily, shooting each other. And it got worse and worse, and then the Nazis showed up on the scene, who were also called socialist, the National Socialist Party. Everybody had that name socialist in there, of the people. And in Munich, where my father and my family lived, they actually had warfare in the streets between the various social groups with machine guns and cannons and everything. It was intolerable. And they just slowly planned to get the whole family out of Europe and come to the safety and the wonderful opportunity of the United States of America. And they really understood what the Statue of Liberty stood for. Opportunity for the working class, free of all that stuff going on in Europe. And so I think that's why they left, that's why we're here, and if we don't know this, then we have lost the original reason why my ancestors paid such a heavy price to give us all an opportunity. And that's the end of the sermon. This area is talking about attitudes towards the way you're governed and socialism in general, and from different perspectives. I can remember in Ohio that my mom and dad very much disliked President Roosevelt. And there was a Catholic priest in the late 30s who was on radio. Remember, there's no television here now. He got on radio, his name was Father Coughlin, and they loved Father Coughlin. And Father Coughlin was a great opponent of Roosevelt and his philosophies. Now, Roosevelt was a Democrat who was moving towards socialism, and you see the results today. The point was, my father and mother disagreed with many things that Roosevelt stood for, including staying out of European political affairs. That's a whole other issue. But the defects in socialism, the Democrats began to rely on promising people things that they had, that they could get from government, and getting elected that way. And that's a form of socialism, which you see really expressed in these days very strongly. What's wrong with socialism? My dad and my mom said, socialism doesn't work. We know, we suffered under it. Now, a little bit I explained already in regards to my dad, but my mom, and then later on my brother Matt, explained to me how socialism doesn't work. And they saying this not from a theoretical position, but from a very practical position. So my dad used to say that if man does not have pride in his work and his creativity, he is just the same as an animal on a farm. He's got no merit. If he dies, there's a tear given, and then it's on to business. That's how the government treats the people in a socialist republic. They resented that. They believed that the individual had a lot of personal merit, and that everything should be done to glorify the humanness of all human beings. So therefore, my dad and my mom took a great amount of pride in doing their particular skill, whatever it was, very, very well and with a proper attitude. So I could understand, because I saw that later on in the teachings of Father Coughlin. What they would point out, is amplified by my brother Matt, was that socialism always becomes the next dangerous government. The same thing that they revolt against, and people think that the voice of the people is heard in socialism, ends up being the same thing they threw out in a generation or two. An example was in Germany. What became the socialist government in Germany became the Nazi Party in Germany. That's a very bad example. My brother Matt told me when he came over in the early 1980s, he said communism doesn't work. He said everything that the communists promised is opposed by government policy. They keep telling people that they have all this control over themselves, whereas they have no control over themselves. He said it's a great lie. He said in the areas of Russia and the Ukraine and Romania and Austria, the places that he lived and worked and struggled and tried to stay alive, it was worse than the worst of capitalism. And this is socialism, the worst. And lots and lots of people in forced labor, all means of production by forced labor, All farms are collectivized. You have no idea what that means. I'll give you an example. When my brother came back from his free forced labor in the Ukraine, he was put on a collective farm in Hungary. The collective farm was built this way. All the land in a certain valley was put under government control. Everybody lost their land, the land they owned. All the women were put in one barracks. All the men were put in another barracks. And all the children were put in another barracks. This is communism at its finest. He said, out on the field, they were supposed to be technologically up to date. They had 10 tractors on this farm. Only one ran because the rest were all lacking parts. But on the books, they had 10 working tractors. Communism is a great liar, even to itself. In the town where they lived, before and after the collectivism, the little town Easthofen, they had only 3 people that owned an automobile. And this is to describe how is this different than the old lord system of landowners and worker peasants. They had the Communist Party representative, and he had a car. There was the doctor, he had a car. And there was the postmaster, he had a car. Everybody else in town walked. This is communism at its finest. And he said, of the 3 cars, only one ran because the rest lacked parts. How does he know? He was the only official mechanic in this town. He had 2 of them in his driveway all the time. So there's communism for you. There's socialism for you. And I'm sure you can talk to anybody else. You'll find the same thing. What socialism replaces, that is the Lord, the master, and his taskmasters. You go into socialism, in 10 years you've got the same system under a different name. You've got the lords and the masters, and you've got the have-nots who are working out in the fields for nothing. There's no reward. The lesson that Matt learned in Romania was the government decided, since the whole country was starving, that they would try an experiment. So they took the farming families, they let them go back to their homes, and said that they could farm a little strip of land next to their homes where we would put lawn. They were allowed to farm and keep or sell anything they produced on that little strip of land next to their home. You got to know that in Europe, homes are all gathered in little villages. The farms are all out there half a day's walk from the house. It's not like in Iowa where every farm is on its own land. So in 1 year, there was more edible produce grown on the strips of land than on the acreage, the mass acreage. And the communists said, this is wonderful. And the farmers said, this is wonderful. We can sell the corn and the grapes and the radishes in the market like we used to and have cash. Not a communist method. Well, the second year, they did it again, and they allowed them to have a little more land, and they could sell that. But the government forgot to give them something. It's called seed. So now the people found out the government is so ill-equipped to run farms that they don't understand what feedstock is, you know, the seed stock. So they had to black market the seed so they could plant their own farms so they could keep the produce and sell it. The second year they did this, the little strips of farming land in the village outproduced the 5,000 acres of land outside the village. And so now the communists said, we're going to tax you. And so they stopped planting their little farms next to the house because they were going to be taxed for it. This is communism at its finest. And so now the people in Arad and other places in Romania were starving again because they choked and killed the animal that they were trying to live on. Communism doesn't work. That's the same thing my brother said every time. Communism is a disaster. And so that's why everything fell apart in the 1990s. Khrushchev flew over Iowa, and he says, who farms all that land? Oh, that family right there. You mean only 3 people are farming all that land? He turns around to his counselor and says, we've lost the Cold War. Because it was individual incentive and inventiveness and creativity that's rewarded, the invention of products, the upkeep and maintenance of equipment. That's what keeps a country growing and developing, and that's what happens. But when everybody's on the take, nothing happens. And your government crushes in on itself, and it's a fatal disease. And that's Papa's advice to y'all about socialism. Beware. Amen.